Okay, I think I'll get us started. I'm Jana Moore-Lone, and I'm the Executive Director of PLATO, and I'm so happy to welcome everyone to this webinar about what makes a question a good question, and particularly happy to be hosting it with our co-sponsor, the Right Question Institute, our friends from the Right Question Institute. And I was thinking today that it was actually 4 years ago, almost exactly, that I began talking with Andrew Minigan about having some kind of event like this hosted by our two organizations. And I bet he'd be really happy to see us all together. So I'm going to start by introducing our first panelist. And she is Dr. Lonnie Watson, who is a research fellow and philosopher at the University of Oxford. Her research is all about questions and questioning, with a special interest in the way we use questions in educational and professional settings. She's published multiple publications and spoken widely about questions over the past 10 years. Lonnie?
Hi, everyone. I hope you can hear me fine. Great. Yeah, it's good to be here. And thanks very much for the invite to talk about this topic. This is a topic that is very, very close to my heart because it's what my research is really all about. So I'm excited to be here to be talking about questions and good questions. To give you a kind of a sense of my research, I am an epistemologist, so most of my research is around issues to do with knowledge, information, belief, truth, anything in that kind of ballpark. And my interest in questions comes from that perspective. I'm interested in how we use questions to come to know things, how we use questions to form beliefs, how we use questions to get at truth, and how we use questions in multiple different ways that are adjacent to those kind of epistemic goals. And that led me very quickly in my research early on to think about education and how we use questions in education context, because I'm interested in how we use questions in order to learn. So that led me to think a lot about the kind of question-answer dynamic in classrooms between students and teachers. And in particular, the effects of teacher questioning on student learning and the effects of student questioning on student learning. And that led me certainly to engage with the Right Question Institute. So I'm super happy to be here again, working alongside Katy and the Right Question Institute. And yeah, I'm interested in certainly how we use questions in education to learn, but also beyond that, more recently, how we use questions in a range of professional settings and work in order to do all sorts of things, learn and solve problems and build relationships and challenge assumptions and provoke and simulate and all the different things that we use questions for. So I'm going to be talking quite a bit about that and about the different ways that we can ask good questions by looking at the different contexts that we ask questions in. That's what I'm kind of interested in talking about today. So looking forward to it, looking forward to meeting you all and talking with you all about this topic. It's also midnight here in the UK, so I just want to flag that my brain is maybe like rambling a little, but hopefully I'll be able to keep up.
Did you want to say any more at this point, Lonnie, about your topic?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. So when we're going into these breakout rooms, my intention is to talk about this context piece and why context is important to ask good questions and to good questioning as a practice. So I'm particularly interested in looking at basically different styles or approaches to questioning. And I've got with a colleague, have developed an assessment and a framework which is called the questioning strengths method and the questioning strength assessment. And we've identified 9 different questioning strengths, all of which kind of bring something different to the party in terms of what we can do with questions, the different types of things we do with questions. And so the idea with behind the questioning strength assessment is that you can go and take the assessment, and I invite everyone to go and take it. Not right now, it takes about 15 to 20 minutes, but I'll share the link at some point, and certainly people are invited to take that assessment for themselves. But what it does is it will help you to understand the kind of like unique profile, your own unique profile with respect to the way that you ask questions. And then what I'm interested in with how we use that tool is by looking at how you can move between the different types of strengths. So it's not that you just have one strength or another strength, but that you have an understanding of a complete profile of you as a questioner. And then you can deploy different types of questioning strengths in different contexts. And that's where the context piece comes in again. So the real kind of skill is learning how to adapt and move between according to the different contexts, and that's what I'm interested in thinking about, particularly with respect to the idea that we are interested in good questions and good questioning.
Thank you. I'm going to now introduce our next panelist, who is Karen Emmerman, who is PLATO's education director and is the philosopher in residence at John Muir Elementary in Seattle, where she has been for quite a number of years. Karen's also taught high school philosophy and facilitated teacher trainings in philosophy for young people, and also teaches a course in philosophy for children at the University of Washington, and is a part-time faculty in the philosophy department there. Karen?
Thanks, Jana. So I'm so happy to be here with you all. I think about questions a lot. And I guess my thoughts that I wanted to share and think about together today are mostly come out of my years of doing philosophy with young people as the philosopher in residence at this public elementary school in Seattle. And I've sometimes found myself feeling in a bind between the desire to really decentralize the classroom by having the students take charge of question asking and question selection, and then the desire to have deep philosophical discussions and build their philosophical skills, right? These two things I find sometimes difficult to kind of find a good balance on. And given that my sessions are pretty limited in time with the kids, I get 30 to 45 minutes every week or every other week. My hope is to get us into a philosophical discussion fairly quickly, right? So there's not a lot of time for massaging questions or tweaking questions or those kinds of things, right? So asking a good question early is important, right? When you're time constrained. So in my years of working with the students, I've noticed them asking seemingly unphilosophical questions or picking the least philosophically promising question when they voted on a list of student-generated questions. And this is in a school with a deep philosophical culture in the building, right? I've worked there for over a decade. Jana was there before that. We have other colleagues who have been working in the school. There's lots of philosophy. Many of the students have philosophy multiple grades, right? All the way through their time at the school. So I'll just preface this by saying, what counts as a philosophical question is of course contentious, and there are all kinds of complications and problems with that conversation. I'm going to table it for the sake of time, but happy to have it come back again later. But I'm going to try and share my screen. So hopefully this is going to work. I wanted to just start briefly with what the kids say when I ask them, what is a philosophical question? And what the kids say is, we can talk about it. They make more questions. They're interesting. There are infinite answers. They're a wondering. There are questions, lots of different answers and no single right answer, which is great, right? Good job, kids. That's a great way to think about, right, what we're looking for with philosophical questions. And it jives really well with what the adults say. So Jana Marlone has said, right, that philosophical questions are unsettled, they're abstract, but they're not unanswerable. Philosophical questions have contestable answers that lead us to deeper levels of abstraction. And so, right, despite important questions about gatekeeping and many seemingly closed questions actually having lots of philosophical promise, we do have something in mind, right, when we ask students to ask philosophical questions in a philosophy for young people session. As opposed to other kinds of questions, right? And so I'm just going to give you a brief example of the kinds of questions that have me wondering about this balance in creating a philosophical space driven by student questions, and the reality that asking good philosophical questions is a skill, right, that has to be developed over time. So I'll give the example of using the book Miss Rumphius. This is a story about a woman who was told as a child to make the world more beautiful. She spends her whole life seeking ways to do that, and eventually she settles on seeding lupines wild throughout the world. It's a beautiful, beautiful story with beautiful illustration. And so here are some examples of questions the kids have asked after I have read Miss Rumphius. When I ask for a philosophical question, even when I give a little primer on what's a philosophical question to remind them, where did Miss Rumphius live? Is there a sequel to the book? Who was the main character? How many words are there in the book? Why was the story so short? And I think, right, when I get these questions, some of them thinking about, right, Lonnie's point about context being so important to a good question, some of them are great questions in a language arts lesson. But in a philosophy session, they're not really what we're going for. And so, right, context really matters. And in the context of my sessions, not so much what I was aiming for, right? So I'll give you one more quick example just to help sort of illustrate what I'm getting at. So here is a list of questions that another group of students asked. So I read the story, asked them to take a minute to think and reflect about what they were wondering about. And then these are the questions we wrote up on the board. Why does she love lupines so much? How do people pass down values in a family? Does the family have a history of passing down values? How old is Miss Rumphius? What was the girl doing on the last page of the book to make the world a better place? When the students voted, there's several very promising questions on this list, I think. But when they voted for how old is Miss Rumphius, which would have us guessing about her age, but there's not much more we can do about that because we're not given the information in the book. So I thought quite a lot about how to move forward in this dilemma, right, of respecting epistemic authority of young people while also needing to build their skills of good philosophical questioning. I wrote a paper that's in meta philosophy that's a rather long reflection on this if you're interested. For now, I'll just quickly say that I think the specifics of the solution depend on age and context. But I generally think that asking a good philosophical question requires modeling from others, space for the group to self-reflect about the questions themselves, not just answers to the question, but about the questions themselves, and time to build the skill of asking philosophical questions. So I tend to think of the community of philosophical inquiry as an ongoing endeavor over time. So I don't think of it as we set up at the beginning of the year how you ask a good question or what's a good philosophical question, and then we're off and running. I think of it as a process over time, over the course of the year, over the course of multiple grades, that developing that skill is going to be this sort of ongoing work. And then modeling and self-reflection, right, for younger students, say kindergarten, the second or third grade, which in the States is about 5 years old to 7 or 8 years old. I try to do a mixture of me asking questions, the students asking questions, me picking questions, the students picking questions, so they can get a feel for the kinds of questions I pick from their list and the kinds of questions they pick from their list. And then I sometimes even within a session, I do a mixture of those two things to try and get us at a good question and also model how you pick a good question, those kinds of things. And then for older students, I'm really in favor of giving them time to self-evaluate. So they go ahead and they pick the question. Sometimes I think it's not philosophically promising, but it is. And yay, I was wrong. That's a delightful day. Sometimes it's not very promising and they realize it's not very promising. And one of them says something like, I'm not sure that's really a very philosophical question. And now we have a meta conversation about what would make it. Is it a philosophical question? What is a good question? Right? And those kinds of things. And sometimes we just have the discussion off of that question. And then they self-reflect further down the line and they realize, oh, you know what? We didn't really get a very rich philosophical discussion out of that. So what do we need to have done differently? What could we do differently next time? What would have made that a more philosophical conversation, a question that would have queued us up sort of in a better way. So I think, right, this is, in my mind, this is one of the ways to do it. Thinking about building question asking as a skill that has to be developed over time through modeling. And then also, as I say, the really important time of self-reflection to sense, for the students to sense where the discussion is going and to feel whether they're getting what they think they should be getting out of philosophical conversation, and then be able to reconsider. I think that's me to time, I think. So thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Karen. Okay, our next panelist is Katy Connolly, who is the Education Program Coordinator at the Right Question Institute, which, for those of you who don't know, is a nonprofit dedicated to strengthening democracy by building people's capacity to ask better questions. Katy graduated from Boston University with a degree in English education. Katy?
Thank you. I'm also pleased to be here. And yeah, I've really appreciated what has been shared so far. I resonate with a lot of it when I think about the question of what makes a question a good question. So I think, so I agree with Lonnie about the idea that it really depends on context. And my initial thought about that question is that no question exists in a vacuum. Questions are inherently relational. They are about, eliciting response often. And so it really depends on what the asker is hoping for. What is their intent or purpose? And so maybe that lends us to think more about not focusing on the questions themselves getting better or being good, but sort of us becoming stronger question askers ourselves and building our skills. And that was something that Karen touched on too, was about how it is a skill and needing the time and the space to practice it. And that is, and kind of, I guess, the reason that I think it's important to question whether there is such a thing as a good question is because if there's a good question, it means there's probably bad questions, or that's sort of implicit in that idea. And sort of wondering about how, the thought of bad questions might become a barrier for some people to ask questions at all. And that's something that my organization has really focused on over time, is how it seems like a lot of us are out of practice with asking questions. It seems like it's a lot easier for children to ask questions. We know that 4-year-olds are asking 10,000 questions a year or 30 questions an hour. And that's kind of observable if you have a young child. And I know, I'm in the education team at my organization. So I work with teachers, and a lot of them who work with older students, middle school or high school students, say that it feels like pulling teeth to get students to ask questions at that age. So yeah, my concern is really with, labeling questions as good and bad, whether that becomes a barrier to people asking questions at all. And so with the Right Question Institute, we have a strategy that's about developing the skill and thinking about sort of what are the different components of that skill. What's the kind of the simplest way that anybody can learn the skill, and to really allow for time to practice it. And one of the things we talk about is the concept of closed and open questions. So we see closed and open questions as sort of the simplest or most observable category of different types of questions, and having students really learn about how their language and how they ask a question can shape the answer. So asking a closed question the way you're asking it probably will elicit a one-word response or a yes or no response. But thinking about how, rather than saying, oh, closed questions are bad and open questions are good, and we should only encourage students to learn how to ask open questions, rather thinking about when is a closed question actually more effective for what the question asker is trying to get out of the conversation. And building the skill of being fluid and flexible between the two different kinds of questions. So that's something that I can talk a little more about in my breakout room. Is we can, I'll give you a little experience in the question formulation technique, which is the strategy that we've developed. You can try it for yourselves, and we'll actually use it to explore this idea of good questions. And then I can share some examples too from students, because that's kind of my work. About just, different question samples like Karen had. I love the ones that you had, and looking at them and what did they tell us about what is definition of good question and how to teach it in different contexts.
Thank you, Katie. Johnny, are you able to put on your video now? I think you should be able to. I'm having a little bit of a technical issue here. There we go. Just in time.
Yeah.
Fabulous, great. I'll just introduce you and then I'll turn it over to you. Johnny Walker taught 10th grade world history from 2014 to 2022 at Triumph High School, a Title I public school in LA. He's facilitated professional development with the Right Question Institute since 2018 and has a master's degree in education from USC and a BA in history from Yale. And I'll turn it over to you.
All right, thank you so much. Is there a way I can share my screen?
You should be able to.
Okay, great. So yeah, I'm going to piggyback on what Katie said. It's been such a pleasure to work with the Right Question Institute, and so many teachers do all over the world. There are, just people who want to flip their classroom and give the students more power. And it's a scary thing to do, to let them drive. But I have 15-year-olds who are literally going to be driving within a couple of years. And so what better way to get them ready to eventually, we're going to have them drive the bus of democracy. And I find no better way than to actually have them feel comfortable asking questions, feel comfortable researching, and then reflecting on the process. I think that's one of the major components of a healthy democratic nation. And let's see here. In terms of good and bad questions, that's something that I did want to talk about because it's surprising that an initial question that a teacher might judge as being bad, or a class clown who asks a question, given the correct context, that question can actually become quite profound. And so I wanted to share some examples. And I'm going to share my screen. There it is. And one of the rules of the, can you see that okay? Okay, cool. One of the rules of the question formulation technique is, or these are the 4 rules when kids are generating the questions. It doesn't have to be kids, it can be adults, whomever. And in my case, it was 15-year-olds. They ask as many questions as they can. We don't stop to answer, judge, or discuss questions. Write down every question is stated. That is, even if they're grammatically incorrect, it's really the idea that we're valuing. And then change any statements to a question. All of this lowers the effective filter of the question asker and makes them feel more confident. And then that's where the teacher can propose what's called a cue focus, which makes the kids, it provokes them. It makes them curious. It puts them off balance, and they ask questions to try to restore that equilibrium. And so as you can tell, here's just some examples of it. On the left is the cue focus. I usually do it in terms of photographs or primary source material. Our students are bombarded by primary sources every day, confounding ones, disturbing ones, weaponized misinformation, propaganda, deceptive advertising. All of this has a way of, we need to, in schools, to give our students the type of tools to make sense of what is confounding. And so part of my job is to confound the students in a safe way and then provide them with the tools to ask questions. So this one in particular was people at the University of Cape Town in South Africa damaging and then toppling a statue of Cecil Rhodes. And so initially students are wondering, you know, what's causing them to do this? And we eventually highlight the sort of prioritized questions. But then there are some other ones, which I put in blue, which are a little sillier, which we don't talk about in the beginning. First, they research and they answer their priority questions. Then they have the context to then look at these questions that might seem silly, that class clowns may have generated, which can then lead to pretty surprisingly profound ones. This is one that has to do with the technology of World War I, and you know, they prioritize, you know, like a doctor would on seeing a patient, you know, what's the problem here? What happened? And then there's some sort of jokers in the class who would say, like, is he cute? Does he have a girlfriend? Which in the beginning, as a teacher, you want to sort of jump on and stop the class from saying questions that are intended to provoke or to make fun of a situation. However, at the end, when we learned about mustard gas and the effect on people, we were all able to think, what if he did have a girlfriend? What's their relationship going to be like after the war? Also, was he tortured? Well, what does it mean to be tortured? What does it mean? What weapons are allowable in war? We end up having these more in-depth, interesting discussions where these initially, you know, sort of disturbing questions can actually provoke quite fascinating discussion. This one, where we first look at the relationship between Gandhi and King, and throughout the research, they learned that, you know, King called Gandhi his, quote, guiding light, and used his tactics of boycotts, of demonstrations, literally from the blueprint of Gandhi. And here then we were able to look at questions like this. Why does he look like an alien? Which was intended to just be funny and think, Gandhi made actually a statement with his dress. He was hand spinning his own clothes to protest prohibitions on the textile industry. He was thin because of his hunger strikes. And so these initially sort of silly questions end up becoming a lot more profound, but they have to be sort of given context. All of this basically gives our students, when they're confronted with a puzzlement, with something that's provocative, to step back a bit, to note their thoughts, to research, and then re-examine what, reflect on their own thinking. And this is from last year, a Supreme Court case where a student actually was shown that they did have the right to make statements outside of school as long as it didn't encourage bullying or violence. And in the Supreme Court case, my student sort of wrote it here, that schools have a strong interest in ensuring that future generations understand the working practice of the well-known aphorism, I disapprove of what you say, but I will defend it to the death your right to say it. And even in our disapproval or our shock with some of the things we see, when we take some time, when we find context, we're then able to reapproach some of those shocking or provocative things and really find occasionally profound thoughts about not just what people were saying, but think about motivations, and also think about ourselves and our own. Students to respond well to these lessons. I like the QFT because we ask questions of what we want to know or think we know what is happening. We don't get criticized by what we ask. And so sort of this open process without judgment, providing context, is something that I really think is key to promoting the civil discourse in our democracy. All right, I'm going to end it there.
Thank you. So we're going to spend a little time now before we go into breakout rooms, just having a conversation about what some of what you all have just said. There's been a couple of questions that have come up from the audience. And I wanted to start by asking, this is kind of a question that came from the audience and a related question that I have, which is, it seems as if to me that questions start with curiosity. And one of the things we're trying to do is really encourage curiosity and like lifelong curiosity in our students. So is it sometimes our response to a question that turns out to be whether the question is a good question or not? And by that I mean, isn't it the case that sometimes a student will have a question, is curious about something, but isn't able to articulate it as clearly? So the question is there, but the way in which it's expressed is not, it's not obvious what it is the student is really asking. And maybe the student isn't even, or anybody, an adult as well, isn't even always sure exactly what they're asking. And so one of the questions is, by what standard do you use to judge whether a question's a good question or not a good question? And especially given that it seems as if, and particularly with philosophical questions, that sometimes it's our response to a question that might make the question philosophical as opposed to the question in and of itself. Although obviously, as Karen pointed out, some are, more easily become philosophical than others. So what do you all think about that? And that's to any of the four of you.
Yeah, maybe jump in and speak a bit about that, because I think this is such a good question about how to evaluate. And I think one thing that's like probably clear to everyone in here, that like we tend not to evaluate, we don't assess, like particularly in any summative or formative way, even student questions. And I think that's a really important question to ask, because I personally think we should be doing that in some way, which means we do need a method or an approach to the sort of evaluation of questions. So I think it's really important, right, as Karen was saying, to not suggest that there's kind of like bad questions and put students or anyone off, right, from asking questions. But at the same time, there's this delicate balance to be struck between also making sure that the skill element of questioning is clear. Like, this isn't just something that you can do necessarily. There's actually a skill that you can develop, and therefore something you can be evaluated on. And I think, for me, my own sort of framework of good questions comes from, it's like a 3-part framework that has content, context, and communication. And I'm just drawing that out because it's hitting exactly the notes that you're pointing at there, Jan, is like that there is a kind of content, which is basically what the student is interested in, or what the person is asking the question about, the thing they're actually trying to find out. The answer, that's the kind of content of the question. And you can evaluate a question on that and that kind of metric, whether or not the content itself is good content, interesting content, worthwhile content, relevant content. But you can't do that in a vacuum. You can't do that in and of itself. So you have to also look at the communication that you were pointing towards, the way that that question is asked, and whether it's kind of articulated well. That's a skill in and of itself, and that's something that has to be developed. So you can try to understand the content, and then you can try to understand how it's being communicated, and that's another layer of evaluation. And then the third layer is the one that I was talking about earlier, the context, element. Is it relevant given the context? Is it good content given the context? Is the communication appropriate for the context? And I think of that as asking sort of an evaluation, a metric that would look at what's being asked, how is it being asked, when, where, and who is being asked. And those are the kind of 5 elements of evaluating a question that we could use, that we could plug into some kind of assessment framework that would allow us to actually do what is quite complicated in a relatively simple way, by looking at all these different complex components of good questions, breaking it down, and then evaluating. The final kind of hidden component is the one that you started with, which is curiosity, or the why are we asking, why is the question being asked. I'm still unsure whether that needs to be included in order to think of something as a good question, but it, you know, it is often a feature of what we're doing when we're asking questions. So it's something that's definitely in the big picture in my view. So that would be my kind of like answer to the general question of how we go about evaluating.
I love that so much because, yeah, I was going to say something about a simpler version of that, like sort of sometimes like if your teacher separating the language or wording of a question from the what you're calling the content of the question, or sort of like what's the concept or idea that the student has thought of in their question. And so I like the idea of, if you are evaluating questions holistically, then you need to evaluate them on all three of those levels. But there may be scenarios in a school setting, for example, that you only want to evaluate on one of the three. Or you want to take one out of the equation because they haven't learned it yet, or it makes it more complex for them, and you really just want them to have articulated something philosophical or scientific or whatever it is. And just as a really concrete example, I work with a lot of teachers. One teacher I work with talks a lot about testable questions, which I think science teachers will be familiar with. And that's a very specific type of evaluation that a teacher might do, is whether or not a student's question is testable. And of course, you would only want to evaluate them on that if you've taught it, and if, you know, that is important for some reason, that they, you know, have a testable question, for example, if they need to then use it in a lab. And so the teacher that I'm thinking of, you know, one thing that's really important in her evaluation is that she tells the students what the criteria of a testable question are, and make sure that those criteria are really observable. So they're not just sort of like vague adjectives about a question, but they're things that the students can actually observe in their own questions, identify and change and shift if they need to. And she gives them stems sometimes, or gives them formats and says, these are some formats of a testable question. Can you go and take a question that the content is there and, you know, the curiosity is there, but it's not formed into a testable question, and change the wording so that it is, and then it's usable for their investigations.
I thought I'd just jump in too and add, I think something that Katie mentioned earlier about questions being relational is super important here also, right? And so I do think that part of the role of at least in the philosophy setting, right, part of the role of the facilitator is to reflect curiosity about the question, right? And so if I'm not sure exactly what's going on in a person's mind, I ask, what do you have in mind when you ask that question? What are you thinking about right now? In a sort of invitational way to sort of reflect this way. I would really love the way that Katie put it earlier about the relationality that's involved, so that it's not just that question written up on the board the way I wrote it, but now it's about us trying to understand each other better, which is a super big part of understanding questions and what's going on for other people. So I think curiosity on the part of the hearer will help with this issue, that whether something's a good question or not is sometimes has to do with how it's being received. By then just being curious about the question itself.
Kind of related to that, someone asked, which was part of what I was thinking about in my question about, you know, people, when someone asks a question, but it's maybe tentative or not exactly what it doesn't reflect exactly what they're thinking or wondering about. But related to that, for some students from a culturally responsive place, it's challenging to ask questions, intimidating to ask questions, perhaps because of negative experiences related to questioning, or the fact that, you know, questioning is not particularly encouraged in many school settings. And so asking a question could lead to feeling like there might be negative consequences to that, or have had past experience with there being negative consequences to certain kinds of questions in particular. So how do you address that?
I think, you know, typically at least when I went to school, back in the 90s and 80s, the teacher was the repository of information. And what I love about the way that Common Core works is that students are taught to use claim, evidence, and reasoning, sort of the big three ways of responding to a question. And so it's more skill-based rather than a specific answer or a specific place. And with the internet, with all the difficulty we have in finding, this becomes sort of the skill that we teach. Can you find a claim that answers your question? Can you find different, I usually have them look at 3 different sources of evidence and evaluate those sources. And so in doing so, it's really about a skill building of how you build evidence, create a claim, create reasoning to respond to something. And I find that, basically and then kids compare their answers to either corroborate or to make, slight changes once they share. And so, these are things that some of us who are trained in it, we do naturally, but to really give them, a rubric for it. And we have that in Common Core, we have that in our AP courses. And so that's one of the things that I really enjoy about teaching using AP rubrics, is that there is that common language where we may not be evaluating the question itself, but we are at least evaluating the way in which we think about questions and how to respond to them.
I think it might be actually a good time to move into breakout rooms. So I want to let everyone, we have just about 10 minutes left, and I wanted to give an opportunity to anyone who had questions for any of the panelists to go ahead and ask them. You can do so you can put them in the chat, you could raise your hand, whatever works for you. Hazel?
Yeah, I just wondered if we could get, Johnny had put up a slide with 4 steps. The first one, ask as many questions as possible. The second one, don't answer the questions, but I didn't have enough time to write the last 2. And he went on to other slides. Is it possible to get that list again, or just out loud the last 2?
Yes, definitely. And actually I'll send this to Katy because she is at the Right Question Institute, and that's where they have excellent resources. I go there all the time and use their resources there. And I print them out and I put it in my classroom when I do it, so I know the rules and the students know the rules. They also have examples and videos of teachers doing this technique as well.
And I'll also say that we will send an email to everyone within the next week with a link to the recording of this, as well as resources that the panelists would like us to include. So we'll have links to as many things as we can in that email. Other questions?
I would like to ask a question.
Please.
Yeah. So I work in tech and the corporate world, basically with startups. So does the formation of how the sentence is formed, is that important for when having an open communication or trying to get an open communication when you're working with your team, working with your entrepreneurs? For example, is it safe to say you should avoid yes or no questions, or is it like you want to start a question with certain what, when, how, whys to kind of make it open-ended? Is that important when you're forming questions?
Does one of our panelists want to respond to that?
Yes. I think it's a component of good questioning. It would be the communication And I think it's important. Actually, one of the things that I think is really fun to do with questions when you're working with questions is change those initial words, change that. Like if you've got a what question, change it to a why question or a how question. And it's really a simple way to reveal how significant the different, specifically the different question words are. Like even why and how are quite interesting, because sometimes you can disambiguate a why question by asking a how question and seeing if it's the same question. Sometimes a why question is like synonymous with a how question, and sometimes it's not, depending on whether you're asking like for an explanation of a certain type. So yeah, I think like paying attention to like specifics, but like playing with how you formulate particular questions using different words is a part of the picture, definitely.
Thank you.
Jose?
Yes, this is a question for Karen. Karen, you mentioned during your beginning speech something about explaining the kids what a philosophical question was. How do you do that?
Yeah, so we actually just talked about that in the breakout room. So I'm sorry for the rest of you who were with me. It'll be a little bit of a repetition. But one of the ways that I do that is by showing them the difference between a different kind of question and a philosophical question. So I ask a question like, what time is it? And then we notice the way everybody turns to a clock and has an answer, and everyone pretty much agrees on the answer. And then I ask them, how would you answer that question if you didn't have a clock in the room? And they would all say things like, oh, I'd ask Alexa, or I'd check a watch, or I'd ask someone who has a watch. And we noticed like, oh, look at that. We all kind of got to the same question. We all know exactly how you would answer the question. There's really nowhere to go, right? So then I ask a question like, is the carpet really here? Or what makes someone a good friend? And we notice that we can't just look somewhere in the room to get an answer to that question. We can't just ask somebody else to get a definitive answer to that question. It turns out lots of people have different answers, and we have to talk about it some more. And oh, look at that. There's more questions that have come up now. And that's one of the ways I get us started, is just that one of the things we talked about in my breakout room was this. I think there's a feeling you get in your body that feels different depending on what kind of answer, what kind of a question is, right? You settle really easily when there's an easy answer definitively found, and a question that has more depth and takes more and is contested and those kinds of things feels more energetic and rattling, I think, in a good way. And so we do it sort of intellectually, but I also do it in this embodied way, like to feel the difference of the like thunk of a question with a definitive answer and the whatever the opposite of a thunk is, right? For a question that just can't be answered in that way, that leads to more. And then we start noticing that, and from there we build thinking about philosophical questions.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thanks for your question.
I'll note that in the chat, Wendy noted that we could ask, what time is it? Could be philosophical if we ask where. Can it be 5 there and 8 o'clock here, as I guess it is for us on this screen? We're all over the place in terms of what time it is. So our answers would all be very different.
Yes, definitely. And we can notice that too when we're in the room, that if we're all in the same time zone and in the same place, it's not actually that complicated or interesting a question. But if we do it in a Zoom class where people are coming from multiple places on the globe, well, boy, it gets interesting very quickly. So the same question can be philosophical or not.
I have one more question, if I may. Younger kids, I'm talking about kindergarten or early primary education. When you, and this is more about PLATO, I guess, the PLATO organization. When you teach philosophy to children of that age, do you actually mention the word philosophy? Meaning, even among adults, I guarantee that of these 44 people here, nobody will give the same definition of what philosophy is. So for a kid of 6, 7, or 8 years old, telling them, I'm going to explain to you what philosophy is. It's almost a wall. You can go right into doing philosophy without having to define philosophy. What do you think?
I'm happy to start, and then if others want to jump in. I think that's right. I don't think I'm in the business of trying to define philosophy for young people. We're doing philosophy and we're being philosophical. And I want them to feel empowered as philosophers and to not be yet another generation of people who think philosophy is just for a bunch of people at a university who nobody talks to, right? I want them to have the word philosophy be part of their life so that they understand their birthright to wondering and curiosity and questioning. But I won't define philosophy for them. They'll figure out what it is as we do it. But what I will do is help guide them toward philosophical reflection and the difference between, say, historical kinds of questions or scientific questions and philosophical questions. I think people pointed in the chat, and we were just talking about, right, what time is it can be very philosophical. So could some of the questions that were on the slide that I showed you. They could be very philosophical questions. It's true. There's a lot of massaging and tweaking and lots of stuff that you can do to make a question that appears unphilosophical be philosophical. But it's also the case that there can be a lot of logistical things that get in the way of having the time to do that. And so it is helpful to develop this skill of recognizing in a philosophical conversation context what kinds of questions we're after. And then we just sort of, Jose, we just, to my mind, we figure out what philosophy is by doing it together.
Okay. Thank you.
There are lots of other good questions in the chat, but we are past time and I don't want to keep people. So I want to thank everyone for coming, and especially our panelists for giving their time and for all the interesting discussions. And we appreciate all of you being here. And please, if you need further resources on this or related topics, use the multiple resources on both the PLATO website and the Right Question Institute website. And as I say, we will send out an email to all of you within the next week or so with a link to the recording of the webinar, as well as some of the resources that have been mentioned this evening. So thanks very much, and have a good rest of your evening, morning, whatever it is, wherever you are.
Thank you.
Thank you.